Welcome to this week's episode of Clouding with a Chance of Insights, the bi-weekly podcast all about the Microsoft Cloud. Now, this week you might have noticed something a little bit different in the fact that I'm standing here, or sitting here, I should say, on my own. David and Cyrus are both taking a very well-deserved break, and we'll be back for the next episode in 2 weeks' time. Now, what that does mean is that obviously I'm going to be flying solo for this week, which means that to the typical banter, for want of a better word, that might happen, obviously isn't going to be here this week. But what I am going to do is I'm going to try and cover off a broad range of interesting bits of information that came across my screen over the last week or so, since I got back. Before we kick off on that, though, I just wanted to cover a little bit of an update in terms of my role within IBM. As you know, both myself, David, Cyrus work for IBM. But this podcast is not sponsored or sanctioned by them, so all views are our own, etc., etc. But I have been given the opportunity to take on a new role within IBM. So as those of you who might have noticed, I was actually probably more in the alliance strategic partnership role within IBM as part of cybersecurity services. But now I'm moving into a broader role within the newly formed Microsoft practice, which a few episodes back, David actually gave quite a good intro to, explained the rationale and what that would mean for IBM. So I'll be moving into the role. In fact, I moved in about a week ago now into that new role, which is the chief architect, basically responsible for, I suppose, technical assurance across the components that are built within Microsoft practice, along with other things like advanced specializations, training, enablement, etc., etc. But anyway, enough about that, because although this might mean that some of the topics I pick for discussion this week might be a little bit broader than they would have been traditionally, it doesn't really, I don't think anyway, impact into what I've been doing around the podcast or around some of the blog posts that I put out onto LinkedIn, etc. And by the way, whilst we're on that topic, anybody who wants to, probably the best place to actually contact me these days is actually via LinkedIn. And we do post the links to the social accounts that I have within the show notes, but LinkedIn is probably the one that I use most. I know it's a bit corporate, but it is what it is. Now, this week, I want to pick up 3 topics, possibly 4, as well as, and I'm sorry to say this, a little bit of a rant about my experience with Copilot earlier on in the week, which I'll sort of intersperse with the sort of other areas. So it's sort of like a not very pleasant sandwich. So nice bit, and then to wrap it up with another nice bit. So without further ado, let's crack on with the first piece of news. Now, whether or not you define this as being good news or not, I leave that entirely up to your perception. But back in November of 23, Microsoft did announce their strategy around the XDR and SIM solutions they currently run. So Defender XDR, Sentinel being the SIM solution. And you've probably noticed it, and I certainly have noticed it. There has been a trend to sort of encouraging people to use the XDR interface or Defender XDR platform as opposed to using Sentinel as the sort of entry point, etc. So back in the 1st of June, so pretty much now, 1st of July, I'm going a bit weird on the times here and the dates. Back on the 1st of July, Microsoft announced the sort of formal retirement or the retirement plan for Sentinel. So basically, by July the 1st, 2026, so in effect, we've got a year to do this, Sentinel will be in effect retired, and the primary point of access or management, whatever you want to call it, for that sort of SIM element is going to be the Defender XDR platform. Now, I don't know how many people have actually started to move away from that, or even probably the first starting point now will be sort of Defender XDR. But certainly from my experience at the moment, there is a number of clients that are still using Sentinel as their primary entry point into the sort of threat management hunting pieces. So there is I was going to say it's a plan, but it's not really a plan, but you do sort of have to start thinking about how you're going to migrate, what that means in terms of user adoption, training, any particular custom solutions you might have built around that might need to be ported. From an IBM perspective, we are having to look at how we transition our managed services, for example, which was predominantly based around the Sentinel Lighthouse solution, into one that is going to be sort of focused and built around the Defender XDR piece. So basically, anybody who's listening from the sort of security side needs to start thinking about how they're going to manage that transition into the new sort of Defender XDR world. The link to the article, as usual, will be in the show notes. And we will probably have this coming up as a recurring topic, to be honest with you, over the next, probably the next 12 months or so until that deadline hits. And who knows, it might not be the most firmest of deadlines, because I suspect that some organizations, this might be a little bit of a more difficult job to do than Microsoft perhaps are putting into that article. Now, the second security-ish related topic I wanted to pick up on is going to be very, very light, I think. And it came up in the Office 365 or the Microsoft 365 roadmap feed. And this is around Microsoft putting onto the roadmap. So again, for people that are into the sort of following what's going on the roadmap, you'll know that they don't give specific dates, times, etc. for some of these new features. But there is a new feature under development, which is going to be around OCR within Purview. And I think this personally makes a fair amount of sense in terms of what you're trying to achieve with that, because it does mean that even if you've got images of documentation or images that might have some context around, written language, for example, a picture of a document, a picture of a sign, whatever it might well be, you'll be able to use OCR to, in effect, translate that into a language that the machine can actually sort of process and do whatever it needs to within that. So I think that is something that will add an extra dimension around this sort of standard Purview functionality, especially for sensitive information, DLP, etc., etc. So that would be something to keep an eye on. As I said, it's in the roadmap. It just appeared a week or so ago. I don't think there's any specifics around dates, but again, we'll keep you updated on that particular topic. So now for the slight tangent. And I don't know whether anybody is really going to be that, or certainly anybody from Microsoft might not be very happy with the next 10 minutes or so of this particular conversation. But about a week or so, or basically since I came back from annual leave, as everybody probably knows, I was on annual leave about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I came back from annual leave, took up the new role. And one of the things that I'm fully aware of is that I am terrible at some of the sort of more admin-y type organizational pieces. So my typical day sometimes can be anywhere from 10 to 13, 14 meetings. And to make sure that I've got notes for all of those and pick up all the actions, etc., or make sure I identify the emails that are related to that meeting, whatever it might well be. Sometimes, I think it's human nature. Sometimes actually just sort of slip. So one of the things I said to myself a couple of weeks ago was, right, I'm going to be a little bit more, not organized, but efficient with how I'm doing this. So I did look around to see whether there was some good, sort of productivity, efficiency tools on the marketplace, bearing in mind that I'm using a Mac. Not a Windows PC, although, to be honest with you, with the new role, I might well be reverting back to using a Windows-based laptop, which means that some of the stuff that I've been talking about probably won't be applicable anymore. So one of the things that I picked up on was Raycast. So for those that don't know, Raycast is a third-party app that basically extends or replicates what Spotlight does. So text-based sort of, search box type interface, and you can type in there, say, okay, go and open this document, or run this search within a particular platform, or do some emojis, or whatever it might be. So it's a way of doing shortcutting some of the sort of common tools that you do. And you can do or integrate Apple shortcuts into there. You can sort of create hotkeys and that typing that then relate to either obviously a hotkey process or a textual input. And I found this quite good. Once I've got over my 30-year, perhaps even longer than that, if you think about the sort of consumer experience before then of using a keyboard and a mouse. to do things. And I do still find myself grabbing the mouse and clicking on some icons instead of actually just going in there and typing, the first 2 or 3 characters of what I want to try and achieve to load up that. I still do find that. So I have to sort of untrain my brain or retrain it to take advantage of that. So anyway, that was one element of what I was looking at doing. The other piece was actually more organizational around my emails. And what I thought I would do was I would try and leverage Copilot to look at how I can organize myself better around that. So one thing I did, and again, this was slightly weird because we do have Planner enabled here. But again, because of the way that IBM has deployed that, I don't think I'm letting any secrets in here. It's not quite as functional as it would be perhaps for most other organizations. So I'll leave that to one side. So I picked up another tool that's available on the Epic Marketplace called, and I'm going to have to go and open it up now because I've forgotten what it was, ClickUp, which I've been using to just sort of manage the everyday tasks. And again, because I can put a command into Raycast for that, which is basically I start to do, create task, for example, I can start the first 2 digits, enter that, and then I can actually do that from within Raycast window to create the task, which I thought was actually quite a nice way of managing it during meetings, for example. Without having to use Planner and Copilot, etc., into that window. So what I started to do is I was in Copilot. I was like, okay, right. What I want to do within my emails and within my calendar is set up a task within that to check the ClickUp board that I'd created, both at the start of the morning and at the end of the day. So start of the day, look at it, arrange it, prioritize things, check up on whether anything had happened overnight, and then basically to repeat the same process at the end of the day to make sure I put all the activities in that I might have missed, etc., etc. So what I did is I asked Copilot to basically just create 2 reminders for me, but one in the morning and one in the evening. And that sort of worked quite well. So the prompt was fairly simple. I'm not going to go through it. It's basically just, create me 2 reminders, one in the morning, one in the evening to, manage or review the ClickUp tasks, which it went ahead and did. 2 slightly weird things that happened there. One is that it originally set things up in Eastern time, which is fine. And I basically asked it why it set it up in Eastern time. And it said, well, because you didn't specify, I've defaulted to Eastern time, which is probably the IBM organizational's default. So it's created them at that point. I said, okay, fair enough. Let's not do that. Let's do it as British Summer Time as it is at the moment. And it went ahead and redid that. Now, what I didn't say is that obviously at the moment, Copilot, well, certainly our instance of Copilot, doesn't have the ability to do things physically within Outlook. So what it did do is create an ICS file, which you then import. And again, there's probably people on this call that are going to say, well, actually, hang on a second, you probably would have been easier to do that manually. And it might well have been, but it was interesting to see how that worked. Now, encouraged by that behavior, what I thought I would do next is that even now I categorize all my meetings. So I've got a fairly small subset of categories, somewhere about 10 different categories that I use for meeting invites. So it might be a project meeting, or it might be around go-to-market offerings, or it could be just some admin time that I've blocked out to do things like timesheets or other sort of admin tasks. So those are fairly well defined, and I am usually pretty good at sort of marking up my calendars with those. What I thought I would do is see if there was a way of using the same categorization within the emails. So if an email came in, perhaps it might be related to a meeting I had, so I might be able to categorize that and say, okay, right, that's a go-to-market email related to this particular subject, et cetera, et cetera. And then I thought it would be really nice if at the end of the day, there was basically a rule that fired off that then went and sorted those into folders depending on various criteria. Obviously, the category being the main one, but perhaps if it had been read or perhaps if it had been responded to, so some other sort of factor in there as well. But the primary one was basically, okay, you've got category A, I'm going to now move that into folder A, whatever it might well be. So although I've got rules already, those rules tend to be very basic rules around, okay, email has come in from this particular, usually like it's a news site or some sort of junk. That's very unfair to some of these organizations, but they tend to be not necessarily work-related ones that I need to look at straight away. So they're typically very much either subject-based rules, or they're rules from a particular email address that automatically get put into a folder, and then I'll go back and read them at a later date. So nothing specifically around this type of scenario, because obviously I might get emails from the same person that might be related to different portions of my day-to-day work life. So I thought, okay, I'm going to ask Copilot how to do this, because that seemed like a reasonably good use of time. And I'm going to make some of the transcript available to you. I might have to anonymize some of it, but I'll put the transcript as much as I can do, either in a screenshot here or within the show notes, or perhaps in the blog or something like that, just to see what we'll do. But firstly, I basically just asked Copilot, right, can you create an inbox rule that will look at the category that's been assigned to an email and move that into a folder? And it came back and said, yes, we can do that. The first time round, it basically said that we'll do this as something arrives into the inbox. So I changed the query and said, okay, no, I want this to run as like a scheduled job every night or something like that. And again, it basically changed it. It gave me a list of the steps I needed to do. I've got this slightly wrong. So first it said, right, I'm going to do this. I've looked at your emails. These are the folders and categories that we think you're going to apply to it. And it actually said in the text, and I will try and put this into the piece, that it's actually applied it. And I went, okay, that's really good. So you've applied it. Let me go and have a look in my inbox. Couldn't see anything in there. So I queried Copilot and said, look, did you actually do this? Because I can't see anything. And it went, oh, sorry, no, we don't have permissions to do this within your folders or within Outlook. So what I can do is I can tell you how to do it. So then it started giving me the step-by-step instructions. So, go to the rules, go and click new rule, or start from empty rule, whatever it might well be, and then go and select this particular field or criteria. So I went back, looked into Outlook, went, that doesn't exist. There is no field that says X, whatever that might have been. So I went back, queried Copilot again, and it said, oh yes, sorry, that doesn't really exist. That doesn't exist. Sorry, that doesn't exist. You can't do that. What you can do though is use a Power Automate flow to do the same thing. Are you interested? Well, okay, yes, fine. Tell me how to do this in Power Automate. And again, it did a fairly detailed and fairly convincing step-by-step guide about how to go into Power Automate and set a rule up that would run once a day that would look at the category that you'd apply to the email and then move that into a folder of your choice. And as I worked through this, and I got to about step 3, and I was like, okay, it's now again telling me that I need to do some sort of filter or like if criteria, whatever you want to call it, on category. And I spent, 5-10 minutes in Power Automate looking at what that might well, how to find that field. And I couldn't find it. So again, I reverted back to the Copilot chat and I basically said, look, I can't find this field. Are you sure it exists? And it then turned around to me and said, oh no, sorry, again, that field doesn't exist. You can't do it this way around. I was like, okay, fine. So you've basically told me one way to do it that was wrong. And when challenged, you said, okay, yes, I know it's wrong. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that to you. You've given me an alternate that I've then gone through and got, again, stuck on it. When I've queried it back to you, you've said that you can't do it that way around. It's not possible. It then gave me another couple of options, but those options didn't actually seem realistic for what I was trying to do. So I actually sort of backed out of the whole thing and just went back to creating some rules that were going to do some different things based on the sender and the subject line and some of the body text, etc., which appears to be working reasonably well, but not quite what I was hoping. So anyway, apologies to anybody from Microsoft that might be listening to this. I've been using Copilot now quite extensively for doing things like meeting recaps, identifying actions out of that, which I'm then using and putting into ClickUp and a few other bits and pieces like that. So that element is really quite good. But I got very, very frustrated. And the good thing is that, I don't know whether this is available for every user, but I was able to send feedback back to Microsoft to say, look, this is what I've asked it to do. This is the response. It shouldn't really have given me this response, et cetera, and submitted that off. So who knows what's going to happen with that. But anyway, that was my interesting experience with Copilot earlier on in the week. Which sort of brings me nicely onto another feature that came up as part of a preview blog post announcement that came out again. I think it was in the 1st of July. Obviously, it seems a popular date for Microsoft to be posting things, probably because of their end of year date, which, as everybody knows, is sort of 1st of July, is the start of Microsoft's new financial year. So this feature was around SQL Server and using basically plain language to manipulate databases. Now, I've got mixed thoughts on this, to be honest. As somebody who did a reasonable amount of work with T-SQL queries, stored procedures, triggers, all that sort of lovely stuff as part of my the long past developer days, it does seem to take the fun out of spending hours trying to figure out how to do this particular query. But anyway, slight digression. Now, what they're doing here is basically developing a Microsoft SQL MCP server, which will allow users to query the database using obviously natural language. I mean, that's primarily the benefit of sort of Copilot and large language models anyway. But instead of obviously you having to write SQL statements to do it, select top 100 products where X equals Y, whatever, and we're having to worry about unions and all that sort of lovely stuff, it will actually sort of do that, but behind the scenes, which I think is actually not a bad usage of this, because it does make, to me anyway, it makes a little bit of sense to be able to say, okay, Copilot, go and tell me what the top selling products were over this period of time with this criteria, etc. And then obviously Copilot will go away and it will try and create that SQL statement in the back end and in effect retrieve and show you the data. What I felt was, obviously, Microsoft has looked at this and gone, okay, well, we can query in the database, one thing. But the example they've given on the blog post is obviously, I was going to say obviously, it's not obvious, but is around users then actually doing that from scratch. So starting without a database, querying Copilot or the MCP server in this instance, not Copilot, to say, okay, look, this is my problem statement. I'm running an event. I want to be able to store or record who I've invited to this, when they're speaking, what the times are, whether we've invited somebody else, etc., etc., etc. And then obviously it goes through then and creates the database. And you can then query and go, oh, hang on a second, I made a mistake. That should be this value instead of this value, whatever that value might have been. And then can you show me how many people have responded? Can you show me how many products we might have related to or sold through that? So I know this is only a preview, and at the moment all I've seen really is a blog post and a couple of videos. That looks like something that might make a little bit of sense compared to some of the other use cases that I've seen. Because for me, and again, this might be because of my background, it does sort of make or abstract the complexity away from, T-SQL, writing T-SQL. And again, you don't necessarily need to know what the underlying schema or structure of the database is in this instance, because you are just interacting and asking questions. So as long as you're not asking salesy based questions of a database that has no sales related information, you should be good to go. That was one. And the final sort of newsy feature that I wanted to pick up on this instance is around Exchange Server. And I know we've not really talked about Exchange Server too much within this podcast, which is interesting. I think it also indicates that how we take Exchange for granted to a certain extent, and we don't even really think about it too much. It's just there in the background, serving us emails and doing its job. But and I think we did talk about SharePoint Subscription Edition in a few episodes ago. But now Exchange Server Subscription Edition is now available. So in effect, it's a version of Exchange 2019, I think, up to cumulative update 15 or 14, which means you'll get feature parity with whatever CU that actually is if you decide to go into the subscription model. And I'm not sure that Microsoft is effectively giving you much of a choice here, but it's not entirely clear within this blog post whether there's still going to be a fully sort of upfront paid version of it. Certainly from what I've read, it's hinting that there won't be, and that 2019 will be the last model that's released in that format. But then you go basically into a model where you're basically paying a subscription fee, and you're going to get a constant update for that version as you go along. So, it'll be in effect, I don't know whether this is a correct term or not, but it would be in effect a forever version of Exchange. You're just paying whatever the monthly costs are. I do wonder, and again, I've not seen any data behind this, so I wonder how the adoption of SharePoint subscription has impacted this or fed into this decision, and or whether the announcements around the M365 local that we talked about in the last podcast episode is related in some way to this. So perhaps they realize that, okay, if we're going to be pushing M365 local, we need to have some sort of subscription model for Exchange, SharePoint. I think Skype for Business was also mentioned in this as well. And that means that we can then move into the M365 local bit, which in effect will then be a subscription version of these products. That's not clear yet, and I haven't seen anything that indicates that's the case. I'd be interested in people's views and see whether they think that might be the case, or whether they've seen some information that I might have missed. But that's Exchange 2019. So what they're saying here is, I'm looking for a date which I can't see in terms of end of support, but they are saying that both 2016 and 2019 are coming to end of support at some point, and then you will have to transition into this version, which is the subscription version. Again, link to the article will be in the show notes, and that covers the sort of technical components or technical news that I wanted to cover off this week. Which leaves me just with the tangent that I often go off on. And at least this week, I don't have to, what's the word I'm looking for? Inflict this on David and Cyrus, unless they choose to watch the episode back, of course. But I got asked the question the other day. And again, just to replay something I said a little bit earlier on, that I actually got into, I was not going to say got into the role that I'm in now, but I sort of broke into technology area as a developer. I mean, I left college with A-levels in subjects that don't really help with any career. I won't say what, because obviously that's too much personal information to be putting out on a podcast. But I felt like, hang on a second, I need something a little bit more sort of hands-on, skill-based, however you want to define it. So I actually started to study development. Standard sort of path, basics, C++, bit of Delphi for reasons I'm still not entirely sure of. And then I discovered Visual Basic, which for me, again, probably just because of the way that my brain is wired, was a really good way to sort of get into development, because you didn't have to worry about, like I was having to in C++, of writing mouse routines. I mean, okay, yes, you could use include files to do that all for you, etc. But it was a much easier way to work with the interface, or the user interface that you were doing or developing, which I personally found really, really nice. And obviously I'd eventually went from Visual Basic into C#, .NET, etc., etc. But anyway, long sort of rambling reason as to the question that I was asked, which was, okay, I've got son, daughter, child, whatever you want to say or have to define that statement. How would I get them into IT at the moment? And I thought that was actually a really, really good question because, well, primarily because I couldn't think of the answer straight away. Now, if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, even a couple of years ago, I think I would have given them a very similar trajectory to the one that I myself took, depending on which, what type of technology landscape you really wanted to sort of move into. But certainly as a developer or even a consultant around cloud, for example, there was a fairly well-defined path. You would learn the sort of basics. You would go and join as either an apprentice or a junior developer, and you would work your way up the ladder from there. And honestly, I do miss not having David and Cyrus to sort of bounce this off of. It's a bit of weird. It's more like a sort of diatribe from me on this instance. But I do wonder what that path will look like now, especially if you look at what Microsoft was sort of saying at Build. Again, earlier on in this week, there was another announcement. I think it was 6,000 redundancies in Microsoft. Admittedly, I think most of those were in the Xbox division, but obviously AI is impacting. Now, whether that's just a change in direction or because of the fact that AI has taken over some elements of people's roles, I don't know. But certainly when Build, they were saying, well, look, we're using AI tools to write X number, X percentage of the solution that we're creating, the app we're creating. And typically, I think you would be probably looking at your junior developers traditionally to be doing that sort of level of work. So I do wonder where that leads us to. So that path that I certainly took, I don't think exists anymore. It certainly doesn't exist in the organizations that are heavily sort of moving into an AI-assisted sort of development lifecycle. And I wonder if the same is true for a lot of sort of entry-level jobs. Again, the first job I think I had, first real one I had, came out of actually the development placement that I had, but it wasn't actually a developer role. It was actually doing sort of sales administration. So looking at invoices, matching them up with the purchase orders, for example, that we'd done, chasing up where deliveries were, etc. A lot of that stuff, if I'm being brutally honest, and I look back on, could be done via, an agentic AI solution. So that entry-level piece there has gone. So I think that we have to be able to look at this and say, well, okay, right, to get into a particular field, whatever that is, the traditional paths have gone. You need to now look at how you do that. And whether that means that you have to then sort of pivot that to become an AI sort of entry-level role, either around sort of prompt engineering or developing the tools or monitoring the tools, whatever it might be, or knowing how to use those tools within that particular domain. I don't know. And that's a question that I think I might leave open and perhaps might make quite a good topic for my next sort of LinkedIn article that I might write. But anyway, on that possibly unhappy note, I will call this episode done. And I will wish everybody a good rest of the week. And we will be back in 2 weeks' time with a full complement of presenters. So including David and Cyrus, which I'm sure you're all breathing a huge sigh of relief about. Now, it just leaves me to say as the last bit, which I always forget to do and should be done right at the start. But please, if you like the content that we produce, or even if you don't, to be quite frankly, please drop us a comment, a like, follow or subscribe, depending on the platform of your choice. Any feedback we receive would be appreciated and would help us make this show more beneficial and useful for yourselves. But having said that, again, I wish you everybody a good rest of the week, and we'll be back in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much.